that I'll wait till I want to acknowledge that this is a very fraught topic. Anything related to police, it ends up being extremely timely right now. A lot of people in the country are talking about police excesses, police brutality, police accountability. Of course, many communities in the United States have been talking about this pretty consistently for hundreds of years, especially Black community, Indigenous, Native American community, trans communities, etc. So we're engaging in a conversation that is both timely and very long-lasting and waited for. We are going to be trying to have a conversation about policing through the lens of some Torah and Rabbinic texts. I want to just say a word of framing about the opportunities and limitations that offers us. First, on the opportunity side, studying ancient texts that have a lot of distance from our day-to-day news cycle sometimes can give us the opportunity to see the mythic and the eternal in our contemporary crises and to locate them in a much longer arc of history. Limitation, I want us to be cautious. There's a way sometimes of reading ancient texts that were produced in a very different socioeconomic context, pre-modern, pre-capitalist, pre-globalization, pre-colonialism, and expecting those texts, because there are sacred texts, to tell us what to do. And I think that's actually it's a fundamentalist desire that actually can prop up in all of us, even those of us who don't live generally fundamentalist lives. And I want us to try to resist that and to have expectations that these texts can shed light. They're eternally pregnant for learning and insight and translation, but still require a lot of active and cautious translation from us when we learn them, and to resist the urge to look at deep three-dimensional, mythic, eternal sacred texts as mining grounds for hot quotes and hot takes. We're going to try to resist that and look at really a couple of rabbinic texts, a couple of that I think can help give us language for a responsible conversation about police and police accountability. Before we go in, I just want to recognize that there's a lot of luggage we're carrying with us on this trip. If there are two or three people who want to share a thought about what's motivating you to be here, what questions are on your mind about police accountability, about Torah of police accountability, I want to give an opportunity. Feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up. We'll hear from two or three people. We'll have things to share, and then we'll jump into some text. Sarit, did you just unmute yourself? You want to share something?
Well, I will jump in. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bernadette Griggs. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Jewish Family Service. And I joined at the invitation of Carol Yellen. And this is a great concern for me as a woman of color and African-American woman. And I have two male adult children that are African-American, and I'm concerned for them in this community. I'm concerned for them in the United States of America. And so, you know, I will take whatever I can learn from here so I can share them with my two male adult kids.
Thank you, Bernadette. Hayden, see your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Hayden, you want to unmute yourself? Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, hi, my name's Hayden Siegel. I'm pretty nomadic by nature, but a long time ago, like almost 7 years ago, I actually, down in Texas, was told by the police there and the judges that I had no rights at all as an American, that they were privileges. And around the same time, I had received a video from somebody in New York of the police there lynching a man inside of a synagogue. And so I got motivated to action a long time ago, towards this end, you know, because it is something that happens, and it's really scary when it does. And a lot of times I feel like, especially in our community, it's so marginalized that they're just like, you can't even speak up about it. You know what I mean? And if you do speak up about it, a lot of times people will blame the victim, you know, and get angry at you for literally being like on the receiving end of it, abuse, you know. And then more recently, I moved out here to California, and within the last year, you know, there was I live up in Carlsbad, and there's issues that we had around Passover. And when it all happened afterwards, the Rabbi Greenberg at Chabad out here in Oceanside received a letter from the police and ended up leaning on the community and sending a letter to all of us asking for basically protection money. And so I decided, you know, it was a good reason to attend this meeting, just so I could kind of get maybe what other people's perspectives were on what's going on. But it really feels like a point to make right now.
Thank you very much, Hayden. I appreciate you sharing that. So let's jump into it. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share a screen for us to look at some text. I'm also, in case people prefer to look at it on a different screen, I'm going to paste a link to the document in the chat. You can access it there as well if you prefer. And yeah, there's some background noise somewhere, so if you're not speaking, please do try to keep yourself on mute while you're not speaking. Maybe Donald and Corinna and somebody who's on a phone, try to mute yourself if you can, and we'll jump into it. Okay. Rachel, do you want to mute? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so here we are. So we're going to start with a passage that is very commonly quoted. It's actually one of the most quoted passages in Jewish progressive settings. But the context is often insufficiently appreciated. So the passage we're going to look at comes from the Torah, from the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 16. It's the beginning of the parsha called Shoftim, based on the first word. We say, the Torah says, judges and officers you shall appoint for your tribes. Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chol sha'arecha. I just want to say off the bat, we're going to read the rest of this, and then we're going to come back. We're going to problematize those words that I've translated as judges and police officers, and just recognize that there's a lot that we conjure up by using technical terms for occupations like that are going to be very different in a text that's thousands of years old, different context. But for our purpose, judges and police officers you shall appoint for your tribes in all your gates, which Adonai your God gives you. And they shall judge the people with a just law. Do not pervert the law. Do not show any partiality. And do not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the just. Justice, justice shall you pursue, in order that you may live and inherit the land which Adonai your God is giving you. I want to point out a few things, starting from the back. Number one, this phrase, which I'm now highlighting on the screen share, justice, justice shall you pursue, in Hebrew, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, is an unusually heightened, emphasized phrase. So we want to know, why is the Torah, which tells us what to do all the time, why is it here using this, this doubled noun for emphasis here of all places? And secondly, what's going on with the verb pursue, as opposed to justice you shall enact, or justice you shall preserve, or justice you shall protect? And I wonder, off the bat, are there questions, are there doors for us to enter, or roads for us to walk, in terms of understanding that justice is itself a horizon which is never exactly met, or that it's our senses of what is full achievement of justice is always moving, such that we're supposed to be engaged in the pursuit and not thinking that we've totally achieved it at any point. Be that as it may, the context for the phrase justice, justice shall you pursue, which we see on all sorts of liberal Jewish, protest signs about every issue, you name it, is actually coming from the context of the criminal justice system. It is in the criminal justice system that the Torah speaks in its most emphatic language about justice, pursuing justice in general. Second thing I want to point out is that this pursuit of justice, this heightened, emphatic, perhaps anxious or nervous expression by the Torah, has a lot weighing on it, in order that you may live and inherit the land which Adonai your God is giving you. I want us to just home in and make sure we understand the implications here, that according to this passage, getting it right, with getting the criminal justice system right, is a sine qua non of being allowed to have a society. It's a great privilege to have the opportunity to run a government, to be secure in land, in this case in the land of Israel for the tribes. From the Torah's perspective, the ability and the right to exist, to stay, to have a society, to have a body politic is dependent on getting the criminal justice system correct, getting it right. The third thing I want to point out, if you look back to verse 19, which is the most we get in terms of specifics for the criminal justice system, it seems to be about willful aversion of the law, recognizing the power that exists in the hands of those who manage the criminal justice system, the great power they have to perjure themselves or to commit fraud. Think back to Hayden's example a minute ago. Who's policing the police or the judges? When judges have the final word on the interpretation of law, what's to stop judges from intentionally perverting the law? The fourth thing I want to point out is that the particularities of verse 19 are things that are usually associated with judges, which raises the question of what are police officers actually doing in this passage. This passage could read very coherently without shotrim, without officers. Judges you shall appoint for your tribes and all your gates, which Adonai your God gives you, and they shall judge the people with a just law. Even the fact that the verb in the end of the verse refers to one of the occupations and not the others. It doesn't say judges and officers you shall appoint, and they shall judge and officiate with a just law. V'shaftu v'shatru et ha'am mishpat tzedek. The only verb there is shaftu, referring back to judges, which can raise a question. Either are police officers kind of an afterthought to this, and this is really a passage about the judicial system, or do we have familiarity with standards for the judicial system that are harder to enact or are not as often enacted with police officers? And the passage is telling us that everything we know about judges equally applies to police officers. Is there a way in which we're acknowledging that law enforcement officials engage in judging themselves? Certainly in the last weeks and months and in the last years, and maybe always for people who have been proximate, we're aware of the significant, when we talk about inequity, inequality in policing, we're really talking about the ways in which police officers do a tremendous amount of judging off the bat, deciding to enter Breonna Taylor's home, etc., deciding who is considered a threat and who's not, even if they're unarmed. And maybe our passage is actually teaching us something extra, that judging is something that happens equally among judges and among officers. So the final thing about officers here, there is some scholarly discussion, which we're not going to go deep into, about who these shoterim are understood to be, what I've translated as police officers. It's likely that they're imagining mostly law enforcement officials who are enacting law after the fact, not crime prevention officers, with people who are, let's say, executioners, lash givers. If somebody is punished, that they're supposed to receive 39 lashes for committing a standard crime, the people who administer that punishment and have to make sure they do it properly and with restraint, and other maybe less less clearly defined roles of enforcement of laws that have been enacted. So what we see is that there is a lot of overlap with our contemporary police officers, but policing today encompasses a much wider range, including preventative measures that might not have been imagined in the first place. Be that as it may, I think it's still instructive for, as long as we proceed cautiously, it's instructive for us today because we are talking about people who are authorized to use violence on behalf of the state in preserving law and order. And that actually is similar, continuous with what we have. Before we move on to a very provocative and classical midrash, rabbinic exegesis of this passage, I want to stop the screen share and open up if people have questions, comments, observations, things that came up for you in that biblical passage. Feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak up if you have questions, comments, observations.
Hi, this is Carol.
Carol.
I wanted to say, you know, you chose a really strong word at the conclusion of what you just mentioned, which is that officers are, I can't remember exactly how you said it, given permission
Empowered to use violence on behalf of the state.
Yeah. Right. And you know, even hearing those words, I think is pretty jarring to say the word violence, that in any way they are authorized to use violence. I think, you know, growing up, I had a different sense of what I thought police officers were there to do, that they were to keep us safe, right? But not, I didn't think of them in a violent way. And so I know we're looking at ancient scripture, and so that may also have looked a little different back then, but I know that there's people who very much are struggling with the fact that police today are potentially, you know, we could say authorized to use violence, and that's a, I don't know, I just wanted to reflect my feelings on that. I think that's a really jarring word to actually give them the power to say that that's something that they're allowed to do.
Thanks for sharing that, Carol. And I want to say, like, you know, violence in and of itself does not necessarily imply improper violence. But let's just be clear about this, that even if everything, let's say there was no racial discrimination, which there's always been in American policing. Let's assume that there was that the justice system was functioning properly. We're still, you know, incarcerating somebody is an act of violence. In the biblical system, giving lashes to somebody is violence. If you or I just did that, that would be considered a civil crime that we'd have to be responsible for civil penalties. And yet the state is allowed to do that. Certainly the death penalty is something that exists certainly in the Torah and in most states in the United States. the fact that it throughout most of the United States is rife with all sorts of problems and corruption is actually a separate, maybe it's a separate problem. But it's worth just acknowledging that all law enforcement and the judicial system are places where we as a society authorize violence. Sometimes it's a quiet violence of just people who are armed patrolling as a preventative measure, and sometimes it's the authorization of restricting people's liberties on behalf of the state. I recommend for people who are interested in legal theory, there's a really, really amazing, phenomenally important legal thinker of the 1980s named Robert Cover, who was actually also an active observant Jew who died young, had a sudden heart attack in the 1980s, who wrote some really important essays on violence and the law of violence in the word, and taking stock of that, owning up to our role in sometimes perpetuating or threatening violence in order to prevent other violence. Okay, so Hayden, I saw you had a hand too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, reading from, I'm a big like political philosophy guy, so I've read like, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and all that, and from their perspective at least, and I think also the Torah kind of agrees with this, just by, or from this passage would agree with this, although maybe to use that violence or that right of violence, it could be judged where it was used incorrectly and therefore is negative, but by giving someone the authority, you've already given them essentially the natural liberty to exercise violence. And so I feel like a lot of the questions that are drawn up or issues brought up by the Torah are a common sense, like understanding maybe of how humans just are, and then how to address that within, like pulling it into a society and determining what's right for our society and what would be wrong, but essentially addressed as those very primal aspects of that society.
In other words, maybe that actually that latent presence of violence that's inherently present in the criminal justice system, maybe that explains why the Torah speaks with heightened anxiety here. Getting this right is so important, even though the Torah speaks about justice and responsibility and law and all sorts of other areas. It speaks much more commonly about immigration protections and so on. But policing in the justice system is the area where, because violence is necessarily at stake and is being used, the concern for getting it right is heightened because the consequences are more dire and perhaps irreversible. And that's why you see this nervous language of tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice you shall pursue, specifically in this context. Alan has a hand raised, and then we'll move to the Midrash after that.
Hi, Rabbi. Thanks for leading this discussion. So I also live in the San Diego area. I'm also a conservative Jew and former military officer. And what I gathered from this conversation is whenever you put someone in a position of power, you need to be able to have some accountability. All of us need to hold them accountable. The more power they have, the more accountability. And so it's interesting, judges have such great power in being the final adjudicators of whether an executive officer is doing the right thing. And law enforcement officers have violence at their disposal, just like a military officer would. We train military personnel and police officers to go into potentially dangerous situations. And because they have that power, it's even more important to have accountability that's heightened. And so, it's a tough situation for me to see when you train someone in the military who is real gung-ho, and you give them, weapons, and you want them to use them correctly. And it's very sad when there are people who can't. And so you really need to increase all the structures of accountability. And I think that's what the people in the United States are asking for our police departments, that we arm them with the ability to do violence, but let's make sure that they're using it in an appropriate way and not abusing it, and stopping some of these habits that have developed over the centuries.
Well, that's a great segue to our next text. So I'm going to let the text respond to your comment, Alan. Thanks for sharing that. I'm going to share screen again. So we're going to look now at a midrash. Midrash is a word that's very difficult, slippery to translate. It comes from a root meaning to tease out, to seek out meaning. And midrash as a literary term refers to the canon of literature unpacking and teasing out the text of the Torah. Some aspects of midrash are basically like, fan fiction, filling in the gaps and backstories, and some of it is jurisprudential unpacking, both in narrative and in legal texts, what is at stake. In other words, really embracing in a full-fledged way the practice that no text ever exists in a vacuum. No text is ever completed in its articulation. Speech is always speech in process. And that's kind of the rabbinic process, is always seeing texts as continually pregnant with more implications. So the acanonical work of midrash, relatively early medieval midrashic collection called Dvarim Rabbah, which goes through section by section of the book of Deuteronomy, unpacking it. And on our passage, it has the following provocative passage. So the rabbis say that police officers should be like, Second, let me reopen that, sorry about that. So sorry. Second, the screen just closed momentarily. Reopen it in a second.
Do you want me to do the screen share? I can have the text up.
I just got it back up. I'm good, thanks. I'm so sorry about that, everybody. I got a security message and I clicked the wrong side to get rid of it. So here we go. We're back. Okay. Thank you for your patience, everybody. It's a funny adjustment to this new world. Okay, so the rabbis say the police officers should be like judges in that they should carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip, so that the one issuing lashes should not be required to receive lashes. Sheyeheh hashoter kashofet. Sheyu hama'asim keneged hamakal v'haritzua v'shelo yeheh hamalket tzarich lilkot. Now, what's going on in this midrash? I think the midrash is curious about one of the questions we already asked previously about what's going on with the reference to both judges and police officers in the same passage in the Torah. And yet the passage seems to refer more to judges by using the verb judging and referring to a system of laws and accountability that we're used to seeing with regard to judges, bribes, partiality, etc. So according to this midrash, the reason for including police officers here is to say that they should be like judges in that they carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip, so that the one issuing lashes should not be required to receive lashes. Now, a little bit of background, as we've alluded to already in this session. In rabbinic law understands that the standard penalty for violating a standard Torah prohibition is getting lashes. Somebody has to administer those lashes. They are state employees who have a lot of, various regulations on how they administer those lashes. Some crimes have more severe punishments. There are capital crimes. There are, such as murder is a capital crime. There are crimes that are punished with excision, which is sort of meant to be carried out by God in ways that are unclear. that be cut off from the Jewish people. But your standard rank and file crime, let's say famously, you know, from the Torah's perspective, eating pork. You eat pork intentionally and you were warned not to, punished with lashes. So what do we make of the power that exists in the hands of the people who are now administering these lashes, who are both punishing somebody who acted in violation of the law and necessarily serve in a ritual form to warn the other people of the consequences if they break the law? So those who carry out, they should carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip, keneged hamakel v'haritzuah, so that the one issuing lashes should not be required to receive lashes. Let's work from the back. So if the standard punishment for a crime is receiving lashes, and there are regulations for how law enforcement officials give lashes, such as you're not allowed to use excessive force, you're not allowed to give more than 39 in any circumstance, and you're not allowed to give more than the person can handle, even if they're liable for less than that. If the person issuing lashes acts recklessly or irresponsibly, that's a crime. So they too would be legally required to receive lashes. Now, as we might imagine, it might be harder to hold law enforcement officials accountable if they are the same people who administer. What the Midrash is saying is that police officers, like judges, should carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip, constantly aware of, made aware by the state of the violent consequences they face if, God forbid, they err in their application of criminal justice. I want to unpack this a little bit for what it means today. A few years ago, in the wake of during the Obama administration, in the wake of the uprisings after the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and other cases like that really struck up a community conversation about police excesses. During the course of that conversation, Chicago's then mayor, Rahm Emanuel, famously or infamously said that, and at the same time, though there had been a national decline in violent crime, Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. saw spikes in violent crime and gun violence around 2016, 17. Mayor Rahm Emanuel famously and controversially said that the spike in violence can be attributed to the general national climate of more oversight of police officers. And that in Mayor Emanuel's language, and the language of many others, police officers have gone fetal. His term for officers are now just not willing to do their policing work. They're holding back. And we heard and continue to hear today numerous expressions like that from Fraternal Order of Police representatives, other police spokespersons, that fine, you don't like it, see how you like it. We just won't do our job. We're going to take our ball and bat and go home. We're not going to do our policing at all if you're going to hold us accountable in the various means that had entered the public discourse more commonly. Rahm Emanuel, so the theory behind Mayor Emanuel and the many law enforcement voices like him are saying, let's really do an analysis of that text, is to say that police officers, in order to do their policing work properly, need to be free of excessive oversight, because that oversight creates a pressuring impact that makes it unreasonable for them to do their job. Police officers can do their job properly only if they operate relatively free of oversight. And I just want to point out, our Midrash seems to be saying the exact opposite. Police officers can be expected to do their job properly, judiciously, only if they face the rod and the whip. Only if they're under such a careful, cautious, thorough regime of accountability that they're aware at all moments that policing improperly would lead to their own punishment, to their own facing the same violence that they wield. We can only expect those authorized by the state to use violence in appropriate contexts, to use it appropriately, and to not overstep their bounds, to not be reckless, to not use it in racist ways, or other discriminatory ways, or reckless ways, or egotistical ways, if they're constantly aware of the consequences of them doing it improperly. We have two real opposite approaches to criminal justice, and I want to imagine what criminal justice and policing might look like in the United States if the judicial philosophy of chapter 16 of Deuteronomy and the Midrash were actually law of the land. And I want to share a couple of examples. When I first started teaching about this in the aftermath of the Chicago police murder of Laquan McDonald, there were a lot of people, especially outside of the Black and Indigenous and trans communities. It was a lot of people's first time really becoming aware of this. Black and Indigenous people have been talking about this for centuries. But a coalition arose in Chicago, similar to things around the country, to reform the police contract. So I want to talk for a moment about just what policing looks like. And different cities are different. So I don't want to claim that what exists in Chicago is exactly the same as San Diego, is the same as Kansas City. There are variations, of course. But there are themes. If anything, Chicago and maybe Baltimore are just a little more American than American norms elsewhere. The U.S. Department of Justice in the first weeks of 2017 or the end of 2016 issued a blistering oversight report of the Chicago Police Department cataloging systemic barriers to accountability. And it highlighted 14 clauses of the police contract that are there, according to the Department of Justice, in order to undermine police accountability, in order that police officers not be facing the rod and the whip, as it were. So I want to just share a couple of those with you to give you a taste of what's at stake and how our Torah might respond to that. One is that it's in the Chicago police contract, the Fraternal Order of Police contract for the Chicago Police, that if a police officer is involved in uses force, if a police officer shoots his gun, or is in any other case of potential investigation into excessive force, the police officer has 24 hours before being responsible to make a statement. You and I, as civilians, do not have that right. If we are suspected for use of unlawful force against a fellow citizen and the police officers catch us, as soon as we're caught, we have Fifth Amendment rights, we don't have to have self-incrimination, we have right to a lawyer, but we're not given a 24-hour grace period before we have to issue a statement. Now, what's different about police is the police are authorized to use violence sometimes, and that's why arrests aren't immediately made. But before they issue a statement for it to be investigated, they have 24 hours. In order to understand the effect of that, I want to just call your attention. Jason Van Dyke, the officer who is now in prison for the murder of Laquan McDonald, he actually had a long history of excessive force complaints on his record, and he had never faced any disciplinary or criminal accountability for his actions before. The good news is that there are strong data indicating that majority of cases of excessive force by police officers in America are done by a minority of officers with these very, very bad records. But the bad news is that the culture and even law is in place to protect those officers. Van Dyke was still on the force. Now let's give the benefit of the doubt. Let's use the bad apples philosophy for a second and assume that the other 8 officers on the scene with Officer Van Dyke all thought he was a hothead, maybe even thought he was a racist, and knew about his excessive force record, and none of them had records like that. And yet, all 8 of them fraudulently signed off on the same perjurious report that he signed off on, lying to say that he was under threat, that Laquan McDonald was charging, and was at close range, etc. All 8 of them who witnessed it signed that fraudulent statement. How did they do that? How were they able to come up with the same lie at the same time? Usually, police know very well, separate people, interrogate them independently so they can't corroborate their stories. The U.S. Department of Justice, I think quite reasonably concluded that that element of the Chicago police contract is there purposely to enable people to get their stories straight, and blasted it as being something that should not exist in police contracts. Another example of something that's in the police contract. It is in the Chicago police contract that if a police officer makes a statement, subsequent to that, contradictory evidence comes to light that shows their statement to have been false. Let's say a video, the local security camera at an apartment building or at a 7-Eleven captured the event and demonstrated that the police officer had given a false report. Police officer is allowed one get out of jail free card according to the Chicago police contract, and is allowed to change their story in order to corroborate, and they're not held accountable for the false story. That creates a motivation to say whatever is most favorable, irrespective of the truth the first time around. If you get caught, you get caught. Then you'll change your story, no accountability. There are 12 other elements of the Chicago police contract like that that were singled out by the U.S. Department of Justice, and that organizing in Chicago has been working tirelessly to change. The police have been working without an updated contract for 3 years. Mayor Lightfoot has not indicated since she's been mayor any aggressive stance toward amending the contract. The other thing that's implied here that has really come up in the national conversation, especially now, is the whole concept of qualified immunity, that police officers don't individually get held accountable for property loss or for other impacts. So for example, in Chicago, and again, I apologize to the non-Chicagoans for the Chicago focus. I'm speaking from the place where I'm most knowledgeable because that's where I'm living, but I promise you there's a lot that can be applied and learned for the cities you live in. The city of Chicago has spent almost $1 billion in the last 15 years settling police misconduct civil suits. Now, I'm glad that the victims of those people who have had so much lost from them, people who have been abused or tortured in the John Burge case, have gotten redress, and the courts have acted on their behalf. But meanwhile, a city that claims it's broke all the time and doesn't have money for civil services has paid $1 billion in 12, 13 years settling these cases. What would that money have, if the taxpayers didn't have to pay that money because police officers didn't engage in this gross misconduct, because we had systems of accountability in effect such that police officers did their job facing the rod and the whip and knew that the mindset for doing policing is the sacred duty that I carry tools of violence and I have to be extra cautious, extra accountable in my carrying out of that violence, then maybe that $1 billion would not have had to be spent because there would have been less misconduct, and that $1 billion could have been spent keeping mental health clinics open, keeping public schools open, more social workers and nurses in the schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot is at stake here. Justice, justice shall you pursue. I want to go back to the screen share, and I want to close with actually another text that raises a different set of questions. On this sheet, you have the link, you can look at it on your own as an early modern comment of the Netziv on our same passage, really addressing the role of the public in this. I encourage you to take a look at it and think about it. We're not going to discuss it altogether. But really interrogating public safety. Everything we've said up until now really addresses the takes as a given. We're going to have a law enforcement system. We have to aggressively pursue justice, nervously, and that has to take place through the assumption that those who are administrators of criminal justice, judges and police officers, must act with heightened accountability, heightened structures of accountability. But let's actually turn to a larger question, because in ways that are pretty shocking, aspects of the police reform debate that have long been relegated to relatively fringe and radical areas of reform movements have entered the mainstream, really speaking much more aggressively about defund the police and really questioning the role of police in our communities in the first place. Even the phrase police abolition has entered the mainstream in, I think, unprecedented ways that are both thrilling to some and also very, very scary to many others, including some who are in favor of reform. And with that in mind, I want to look at a fascinating passage from the Talmud Yerushalmi, let's say a 5th century CE text coming out of Roman-occupied Palestine, addressing this question of what the role of agents of violence to preserve order in the state really is. Who keeps us safe? The Talmud teaches Rabbi Yudan the Nasi, so the head of the rabbinic community, sends Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Asi, and Rabbi Ami to travel the cities of the land of Israel. These are all prominent 3rd century Palestinian rabbinic teachers. He sends them to the cities of the land of Israel so as to appoint teachers of Torah and Mishnah for them. What we know is that there were some centers of rabbinic life around Tiberias, around Yavne, but there are a lot of areas of the community in the land of Israel under Roman occupation that were very far from Torah, were very religiously syncretistic, lacking in even basic Torah literacy or knowledge in the land of Israel. A little bit later, around the same time, Babylonia, the situation was under more rabbinic control and they had more flourishing. But the land of Israel was somewhat of a spiritual Wild West at this time, depending on where you were. So Rabbi Yudan sends these emissaries out to appoint teachers of Torah and Mishnah, cities across the country. They arrive in one place and couldn't find any teachers of Torah or Mishnah. So they say to the city's resident, they say to them, unclear if it's the residents or the leadership, kind of like, let's say they go to like the city council and they say, bring us the city's protectors and the city's guards, Nature Karta and Santure Karta. So they, the residents of that city, say back, they bring them the people and say, these are our city's protectors. So these rabbis respond, these are nothing but the city's destroyers, Haruve Karta. These aren't protectors, but destroyers. So the residents say back to them, so then who are the city's protectors and guards? And you can already imagine this background, this very confusing situation. Presumably, when they say the protectors and the guards, they brought out the protectors and the guards. They brought out cops. They brought out police and said, here are our city's police, the protectors. And now these wise guys coming from elsewhere are saying, those are destroyers. They're not protectors. So then who are the city's protectors and guards? And these rabbis respond, teachers of Torah and Mishnah, Safraya Umatnianya. And this is the meaning of that which is written in the book of Psalms, unless God watches over the city, the watchman keeps watch in vain. That's a provocative text, and it's a confusing text, and I think it points in a few different directions. And I want to open up what some of those lanes of thought are. We're not going to resolve it all. There's a direction you could take this text that probably is the direction that that most interpreters of this text in the last century have taken it. This has been a text that's been a favorite of some of the most extreme anti-Zionist and really anti-government Jewish thinkers and parts of the Hasidic world have taken. that the reading of this text is really an estual of politics and government, and sullying ourselves with the messiness and the violence of this world. In fact, that phrase, the Neturei Karta, is best known, the guardians of the city, is best known as the famous anti-Zionist extreme Hasidic group in Israel, who is really against Jewish people, Jewish communities engaging in public politics and government in any way, saying that like we should be operating in a more passive role of studying Torah. And I think that is a reading that can be sustained by this text. There is another reading which I think our broadly speaking social community can have to offer that I think is equally coherent and compelling as to what this Talmudic passage might mean, that I think deserves more hearing. Which is to say that it's not a rejection of engagement in the stuff of politics and government and the messy life of keeping a community clean, keeping a community safe. But it's that we're kidding ourselves if we think that just more and more policing, more and more agents of violence are what ultimately keep us clean, what keep us safe, sorry. I don't know why I keep saying clean, what keep us safe. Ultimately, what keeps us safest long-term is the manifestation of culture and education. According to this reading, it isn't necessarily a rejection of having policing in a city, but it's of seeing those police forces as being ultimately what our protectors are all about. Coming back to Chicago, in the second term of during Rahm Emanuel's mayoral administration, he famously closed 50 elementary schools, 47 of which were in Black and brown communities on the south and west sides, which are the most under-resourced communities, and said that, you know, it's Chicago has to make cuts somewhere. It's painful, but we got to tighten the belt. Similarly, he closed almost all the mental health clinics in the city, and I think all but like one, if I remember correctly, in Black and brown communities on the south and west sides. So the places that have been most traumatized are now stripped of the social services, the culture-giving services for mental health. And yet, a couple of years later, when he hired 900 new police officers, and people said, wait a second, I thought you said the city's broke, and he very sternly responded, we will always find the money when it comes to our public safety and security. And I think according to our, I think, more nuanced reading of this Talmudic passage, we should really be questioning that. And, you know, does excessive over-policing lead to more safety and security? Or are the things that really produce more safety and security in the long term manifestly invested systems of culture and education? What made these cities unsafe was that, and I think what these rabbis are pointing to is, they first went around and didn't find any teachers. They didn't find any teachers. But the city council knew exactly where to turn. Who are the protectors? It's these police officers. And I think maybe what they're saying there is that it's out of whack. And I think that gives us some provocative Jewish language to listen carefully to the hashtag defund the police movement and say, we might fall in different places about how far this goes and what the end game is. And we may not know, we may learn as we go, but something is severely out of whack when really since the Reagan administration, there's been such a drastic underfunding and defunding of public education, mental health, pensions, culture, all sorts of aspects, especially in America's cities, in underfunding of what is maybe the real Neturei Karta, the Santurei Karta, the guards and protectors of the city, which are culture, opportunities, job training, mental health, support systems, everything surrounding education. While there's been ever increasing investments, especially after the second Iraq War, in more heavily militarizing local police, adding police officers, incarcerating more people, etc. And maybe that actually does the opposite. That destroys our city. It destroys communities. I do want to hold on to it is possible. I want this text to open us to listen to what might be hard things to process, difficulties of imagination, that maybe police in and of themselves are destructive, and we should be thinking of police as destroyers of the city more robustly, not just because of proportions, but in and of themselves. That is a reading of this text that I think is coherent, and I think in our contemporary moment, it invites us to listen carefully to the serious, thoughtful voices of more radical abolition, the Mariam Kabas of the country, while we also take seriously a coherent reading that's saying it's just excessive policing while culture and education have been defunded and underfunded that destroys our cities and makes us unsafe. But that either way, our tradition might have a voice to say, what really makes us safe in the long term is Torah, broadly constructed as the life-giving, eternally living and relevant sources of education and culture. And that police, to whatever extent they make us safe, are a secondary force subordinate to our culture creating elements, and that if police are going to do whatever their role is properly, we can only expect them to do it properly if they operate under a very, very rigorous regime of accountability, one that would never hear of qualified immunity or of exemptions from the same kinds of accountability that regular civilians have in their own jobs or as public citizens. The police officers and judges, because of the violence they wield, are held, if anything, to an even more robust standard. And the people who go into policing work should be embracing this as a sacred duty, a sacred consequence of what it means to hold public security in their hand and to feel the terror that I, God forbid, never want to use these tools of violence improperly. We'll pause there. Rachel, do you have any concluding thoughts about other Avodah opportunities coming up?
Thank you, Aryeh, for that teaching, and thank you everyone for joining. And I will put our link in the chat for other online learning opportunities. So stay tuned there. And I think Aryeh I don't know if you're able to stay on for a few minutes if folks have questions or comments.
Yeah, I'm happy to stick around for another few minutes if people want to stick around. But it's officially over. You're dismissed. Not that you're all like grown-ups.